The check landed on my dining table before the steam had time to lift from the coffee mugs. It made a crisp sound, like a playing card slapped onto a green felt table, like a choice you couldn't take back once everyone saw it. Outside, a gray Seattle drizzle tapped the cedar deck in a steady rhythm, and the rotisserie chicken I'd set aside for Father's Day lunch cooled in its Costco clamshell, as if it, too, had lost its appetite. I'd spent the morning polishing the good silver, setting out 2 plates, and telling myself that 3 hours with my daughter was enough. Then her Audi pulled up early, and she didn't come alone. Linda stepped in first, umbrella ticking with rain, her perfume the same one I'd once tucked into Christmas stockings. Behind her came Grant Whitaker, the kind of man who took up space with his shoes alone, a stepfather manufactured from bright ties and bright promises. My daughter, Evelyn, held the door with one hand and her portfolio with the other, cheeks flushed the way they used to after a Mariners win when she was a kid, but the light in her face skewed past me to Grant in a way I felt more than I saw. The check was thick stock with a watermark that caught the kitchen light. A clean, elegant 6 figures written in Grant's confident hand. It lay between the coffee rings and the napkins I'd folded, as if I were hosting a polite negotiation instead of Father's Day. I had brewed Pike Place roast the way Evelyn liked it, cream already in her mug, a habit from years ago that smelled like afternoons and safety. She glanced at the check and then at me as if measuring the air. There was something rehearsed in the silence that followed, as though all 3 had agreed not to say the important thing until the room had absorbed the prop. I noticed everything and pretended not to. The battered red Craftsman toolbox by the door, placed where it always lived in case a hinge squeaked or a leg wobbled. The picture frame on the mantel with Mariners ticket stubs pinned behind glass. Game after game where we learned to speak the same language again after arguments. And the sealed white envelope propped next to it in Linda's handwriting. For Evelyn at 33. Like a lighthouse you don't mention while you're still at sea. I caught Linda's glance at that envelope and filed it away. Some things are louder when no one says them. Grant let the check sit there like a spotlight. He did not say much at first, only adjusted the cuffs of his charcoals and watched the 3 of us breathe. When he finally spoke, he did it with that easy warmth that makes strangers tell secrets. A head start, he said, as if the numbers weren't heavy. Fuel, not a leash. He aimed it at Evelyn, but his eyes tracked my reaction the way you watch a weak beam in a storm. She reached out and touched the corner of the paper with one finger, almost reverent, and I felt something tilt. I told myself it was only the rain sliding off the gutters. I tried to keep things plain. I pointed to the plates I had set, the chicken I would cut, the salad I had tossed with basil from the single plant that survives me every summer. You all hungry? I said. It'll be better hot. The Mariners murmured in the background. A game I had not planned to watch but turned on to soften the edges of waiting. Evelyn slid into a chair, smoothed a wrinkle in her blazer, and picked up her mug. When she finally looked at me squarely, it was with a thin line of determination I recognized from the first time she rode a bike down our block in Ballard, refusing to cry when her knees skinned on the concrete. She talked about her marketing firm as if she were pitching to the city itself. Small businesses left behind by algorithms, a niche that deserved a champion, a model she had stress-tested. I heard her and I was proud, pride that felt like a muscle ache in the chest. But as she spoke, her thumb kept brushing the edge of the check, a small repetitive motion like a metronome counting out who held time in the room. Linda nodded with a smile that managed concern without crossing into apology. Grant added a word here and there, his voice unconcerned with oxygen. 3 hours, I had told myself, would be enough to remember how to talk to your child when there is another man in the room claiming to know her better. 3 hours was generous when the calendar had held so many weeks of silence. But Father's Day doesn't bend for a script. It breaks where it wants. The first blow was not a hand. It was a sentence spoken sweetly. He gets it, Dad, Evelyn said, almost tender, and in the same breath that tenderness was a scalpel. He believes in me the way a real father does. The words hung there, thin and sharp. For a second, I thought I'd misheard. The rain had softened. The neighborhood quieted. The steam from the coffee rose steady as if none of this was theater. Real father, she had said, and in the space it opened, I heard 1,000 late nights building solar system projects at the kitchen table and the small sound she made when she was asleep in the back seat on the way home from a game. I heard how quiet a house gets when the door closes on a family for the last time. Linda's breath hitched. That little catch from a lifetime ago when she didn't want me to see her flinch. Grant didn't look at me. He looked at Evelyn the way a coach looks at a player who has finally learned the system. I stared at the check because it was something to focus on that wasn't my daughter's face. When I finally looked up, I made my voice level. "That's a lot of fuel," I said. "Enough to burn a hole in the floor if it leaks." It would have been a clean insult to reject the money outright, to say what pride wants to say. But Father's Day teaches you how little pride has to do with love. I don't know if the next part would have happened if the room had been built differently, if the rain had come harder, if the coffee had been stronger. I only know that the heat rose behind my ears and my mouth went dry, and something old, older than arguments, older than divorce papers, older even than her birth certificate, pushed me to stand and try to steady the house. "I can match it," I said, before I knew all the ways those words would bend the day. Came out calm. Came out as if I had practiced. It did not tremble, and it should have. Linda's eyes flicked to mine. Grant's smile stayed polite, but he did what men like him do when a beam that looks thin doesn't bend where expected. He tested it. "That would be quite a vote of confidence, Frank." Terms. I reached for the drawer near the sink, the one that holds pens and warranties and small objects that don't belong anywhere else. I set a sheet of paper on the table and wrote a single line in my everyday blue ink, checked the date twice and slid it forward. "A receipt," I said. Simple. A sign that the person receiving the money understands it is a gift and only a gift, and that there will be no meddling dressed up as mentoring. I kept my eyes on Evelyn while I said it. No strings, no votes, no quiet substitutions of leadership, no meetings called without the person who owns her own name. The silence that followed was not long, but it was deep. Grant's courtesy had a crack in it now. Linda's hand tightened on the handle of her mug, knuckles pale. Evelyn didn't speak. I kept going because momentum is a mercy sometimes, the way a ferry doesn't stop for waves. "If we're trading checks and calling it love, I'll trade a line of ink for a promise," I said. "That's my price." Grant did not pick up the pen. He didn't have to. His eyes told me he'd seen this dance before, at other tables on other holidays, with other families trying to hold on to the old word for father while the new word flexed in the mirror. I could have left it there, in a stalemate neat enough to cut around and serve with lunch. But I had prepared something else, not as performance, not even as weapon, but as a necessary story. "I already put money into a firm like yours," I said, and watched Evelyn's face because faces are better than answers. Confusion first, then offense, then the calculation that you do when you realize the past did not stop just because your attention did. "Pilot in Tacoma," I added. 25,000 of my savings, 6 months ago. They're running a campaign for a family-owned hardware store and a bakery that rebranded after the pandemic. I wanted to understand the sinkholes before you had to step around them. I didn't tell her how many inspection jobs it took to set the money aside, how many crawl spaces and attics and stubborn gutters I'd met, so I could talk to her in numbers if that was the only language she had left. I didn't tell her about the nights I lay awake mapping costs against courage, or the afternoons I drove down to Tacoma and watched a team half her age argue their way into a decent tagline. I told her only the part she needed, that I had bet on the kind of work she wanted to do quietly, and not because I doubted her, but because I wanted to meet her where she was going. Fire flickered behind her eyes at that. "You did this without telling me," she said, and the sentence held more accusation than the words deserved. I almost laughed at the symmetry of it. "You asked me to believe in you," I said. "I practiced. If I had left it alone, maybe we could have clung to that uneasy rope and made our way to dessert. But days that begin with checks rarely end with dessert." It happened fast. A flash of her hand, the sound like a small thunderclap in a small room, and the clean sting on my cheek. There was a beat of absolute stillness where all three of us examined the air in case something else had cracked. The coffee scent returned, oddly sweet. The rain chose that second to soften against the deck, as if the city believed in dramatic timing. Linda gasped the way mothers do when history shows its teeth. Grant's chair creaked as he shifted his weight and calculated again which version of himself he needed to be next. I let my breath come back slowly because there is nothing worse than looking like you're drowning in front of your kid. The slap was not the worst thing that had happened to me in that kitchen. It was simply the newest. It was also not the end of anything. It only exposed the part of the bridge we had refused to reinforce. I dabbed the corner of my mouth with a napkin and set it down carefully, the way you put a tool back where it belongs because you trust you'll need it again. When I finally spoke, I didn't look at Grant because he was not the point, and I didn't look at Linda because this was not her confession to make. I looked at Evelyn the way you look at a photograph you've carried too long in your wallet, surprised by how much of it you can still see despite the wear. If you want a father who writes checks and calls it love, you have one, I said. If you want the other kind, the kind who chose you the way a man chooses a house to fix and live in and be buried out of, you can meet me tomorrow at noon on the Bainbridge ferry. I reached into my pocket and set a small brass key next to the check. It was unmarked, a simple thing warm from my hand. She didn't recognize it, and that mattered. Bring this, I said. If you don't want to come, keep it anyway. You'll know when to use it. Linda stared at the key as if it held a map. Grant's gaze flicked toward the mantel and back, as if he sensed some other piece in the room but couldn't quite find it. I felt an old steadiness settle in, the kind that arrives when you accept that you cannot argue someone into love. You can only set the stage for choice and make sure the door is not stuck when they decide to walk through it. The check still sat there, the bright center of the day, but it felt smaller now, as if money had finally remembered it was only paper. I poured more coffee because that is what you do when there is nothing else to say and you still have to live through the next 5 minutes. Evelyn did not touch the check. She did not touch the key either. She pushed back her chair and stood with the same squaring of the shoulders she had at 8 when she decided she would not be scared of the diving board. She walked to the mantel instead. Her fingers hovered over the picture frame with the ticket stubs and then moved to the envelope with her name. She didn't pick it up. She let her hand rest on it like a question. I did not tell her what was inside because suspense is not a trick. It is a truth you honor by letting it arrive on its own feet. I did not tell her the key opened more than a lock. I did not tell her about the storage unit or the blue Pelican case or the way certain papers sound when you lift them from a plastic bin after years of silence. I only said, "Tomorrow?" and made sure my voice didn't ask. Grant gathered himself to the size of a man who leaves when he decides to, not when another man's sentence ends. He reached for the check with a careful hand, then seemed to reconsider and left it in place, as if moving it would turn the page too soon. Linda adjusted her scarf and looked like she wanted to speak and like she had already rehearsed not doing it. Evelyn took her portfolio, then took nothing else. At the door, she turned back just enough for the profile that still kills me. "Noon," she said, and it was not a promise. It was a test given neutrally in a neutral room on a neutral holiday where love had wandered in dressed as finance. The rain picked up again as the door closed behind them, and I stood in my kitchen with my face stinging and my hands steady and my table holding 2 objects that did not belong together. I put the silver back carefully and clicked off the game. I turned the oven on low to warm the chicken because you never know who might be hungry later. I washed the coffee mugs, wiped the ring from the wood with the soft side of the sponge, and left the key where she could imagine it. I didn't open the envelope. I didn't touch the check. I looked at the red toolbox by the door, the one that knows the weight of every screw I've ever tightened, and thought about how most things break quietly, then all at once, then hold if you brace them just right. When I finally sat down, the house exhaled with me. I could hear the neighborhood again, the dull thump of someone dropping a load of laundry, the small laugh of a kid 1 block over, a dog shaking rain from its collar, the ordinary sounds of a life that could bear one more choice. The key glinted against the check like a truth answering a dare. Noon, I told myself, and watched the room learn how to wait. The ferry always smelled of salt and engine oil, and even after all these years it felt like a passage into some other version of myself. That next morning, after the slap and the check and the silence that wouldn't leave my kitchen, I drove down to the terminal at Coleman Dock with the brass key in my pocket. The rain had let up, leaving the streets slick and shining, the kind of Seattle morning where the city seems unsure if it wants to wake up. I parked my aging Honda near the water and leaned on the railing, watching the gulls circle above the waves. Bainbridge lay ahead, but in truth I was heading deeper into the past than any island could hold. I thought about Evelyn as a child, back when my life still had a rhythm I could count on. I had worked as a structural engineer then, 40 hours a week that often bled into 60, building offices and bridges that people crossed without ever thinking about who measured the steel. I used to come home with graphite smudges on my hands, and she would run to me in the doorway of our Ballard house, clutching whatever art project her teacher had praised that day. There was a time when she believed I could fix anything, when every scrape on her knee and every math problem she struggled with ended with her looking up at me as though my answer was the only one that mattered. I held on to that belief like oxygen. The fairy horn bellowed, deep and low, and I felt the vibration in my chest. My marriage had not collapsed all at once, and I suppose that's why I missed the warnings. Linda had once been proud of my steadiness, but steadiness turns invisible when the world around you speeds up. After the firm cut me loose at 60, replaced half the department with software, I told myself I would bounce back. Too old to start over, too young to quit. The months bled into years, the severance shrank, and Linda's patience shrank faster. She began wearing new scarves, ones I hadn't seen before, gifts that didn't come from my paycheck. I ignored the late nights, the sudden laughter on phone calls she took in the other room. I ignored the way Evelyn started quoting Grant at the dinner table before I had even met him. The ferry rocked as cars clanged down into the hold, and I closed my eyes against the sting of memory. It wasn't just losing my job. It was losing the little rituals that had bound us. Saturday mornings grilling pancakes while Evelyn measured flour with too much enthusiasm, spilling half on the counter. Little league games where I shouted until my voice cracked, proud even when she struck out, proud especially when she struck out and still held her head high. The summer we drove down the coast to California in a rusted van with no air conditioning, windows rolled down, the three of us singing along to the Eagles while the desert heat poured in. Those were the years I believed were permanent, the foundation you build once and never have to reinforce. I was wrong. The brass key in my pocket dug into my thigh as I shifted against the railing. It belonged to a storage unit in Soto, a place I had rented 5 years earlier when the divorce took more than half of what I owned. I had filled it with plastic bins labeled by year, a private archive of receipts, report cards, and the kind of letters nobody bothers with anymore. Inside, behind those bins, was a Pelican case with a numeric lock. Evelyn had no idea it existed. I hadn't wanted her to know until she needed to, but last night had shifted everything. She had called another man her real father and struck me in the home I had built board by board. There are truths you can hold back for years, and there are truths that demand to be spoken when silence becomes unbearable. I remembered the first time Evelyn asked me about college. She had been 16, sitting cross-legged on the garage floor while I sanded the wood for a bookcase. "Do you think I could get into UW?" she'd asked, cautious, as though ambition itself might offend me. I told her she could get anywhere if she worked hard enough, and she did. I paid every semester out of pocket, piece by piece, scraping from my savings, selling the fishing boat my father had left me, taking on consulting jobs that left me falling asleep at the dinner table. I never told her what it cost me. I wanted her to believe the world was wide open, and for a time she did. She graduated with her head high, tossed her cap in the air, and hugged me like the whole thing had been our victory together. I keep a photograph of that moment in the storage unit too, sealed in a frame I couldn't hang because the walls of my smaller house didn't have space for all the memories. The ferry's engines shifted, vibrating through the deck, and Bainbridge drew closer. I thought of Linda again, the way she had looked yesterday at my table, purse clutched like a shield, unable to meet my eyes. She had once written Evelyn a letter, for Evelyn at 33, though she never gave it to her. That envelope still sat on my mantel. I hadn't opened it, but I knew the weight of it. A confession, perhaps, or a warning, or just another apology timed too late to matter. Evelyn had touched it yesterday with the same fingers that had left a red mark on my face. She hadn't taken it, though. Not yet. I realized, standing there in the morning wind, that part of me had been preparing for this confrontation longer than I admitted. I had spent 5 years collecting evidence, protecting what little I had, filing reports with the police when Grant's threats were too subtle to be crimes but too sharp to ignore. I had built a trust in Evelyn's daughter's name, a legal wall against the erosion of everything I had left. I had hidden it not out of secrecy but out of love, hoping I would never have to use it. Last night made it clear that hope was a luxury I could no longer afford. The ferry docked, metal clashing against metal, and the crowd shifted toward the gangway. I stayed still a moment longer, watching the gulls wheel above, before moving with them. My hands shook only slightly as I pressed the key in my pocket. Tomorrow or the next day, Evelyn would learn what had opened. She would learn what her mother had signed years ago, what her stepfather feared most, and what I had been willing to give up so that she and Nora would never have to wonder where home truly was. She would learn that love wasn't a check waved at a holiday table. It was a lifetime of showing up, again and again, even when the world had decided you were finished. And though the memory of her words, real father, still cut me raw, I also knew something else. She had agreed to meet me here. She had taken the key. Somewhere inside her, under the noise and the influence and the easy promises of wealth, she still wanted to know which man had really carried her all those years. That was enough. For now, that was enough. By noon the ferry had traded its diesel breath for sun-warmed wind, and the sound flashed like a field of coins. Evelyn found me at the rail without calling my name. She stood a step away, chin lifted as if the horizon could answer the questions she wouldn't give to me. I didn't reach for her. The brass key I'd left on my table had found its way into her pocket. I could see the outline against her blazer. Some part of her had already said yes. We didn't speak as the boat groaned into Bainbridge. I handed her the paper cup of coffee I'd brought from the terminal and pointed toward the ramp with my jaw. On the car deck, her reflection flickered on the backs of damp bumpers. There and gone. She followed me to the Honda like we were still in some half-remembered routine. Her backpack thumping against the door, my hand checking the mirrors twice out of habit. Downtown Seattle rose ahead, glass catching light like it had been waiting for us. Back in the city, we didn't go to the storage unit first. I stopped on Capitol Hill at a narrow cafe that smelled like citrus cleaner and espresso, the kind of place where laptops look more at home than plates. We took the two stools by the window, the ones with a view of a bus stop and a mural I'd watch change every few months. While she stirred sugar into her coffee, even though she doesn't take sugar, I opened my battered Chromebook and pulled up the King County Recorder's portal. The screen's light painted her face with a cold glow. I typed in a string of surnames I'd memorized during months of insomnia, women who had taken investment from Grant Whitaker and then disappeared from their own companies. There's detail in silence that you miss if you fill it with talk. The first document loaded. A UCC-1 filing that looked benign until you followed its teeth. Security interest in all present and after-acquired assets. It said, the kind of sentence that sounds like nothing if you've never watched it empty a bank account. I scrolled. There were convertible notes that matured into control, insurance riders that treated people like inventory, board consents signed at odd hours from IP addresses that weren't in Washington at all. This isn't a pattern, I said, not looking at her. It's choreography. She read the screen without blinking, the way she did as a kid when flashcards became a game she would not lose. Her mouth tightened on one side the way her mother's used to when a fact contradicted a story she preferred. When I clicked to the next company, a bakery in Queen, and that had taken a small infusion and then announced a leadership transition. She reached for the touchpad like she wanted to shove the cursor back into yesterday. Grant mentors founders, she said finally, the defense arriving late and without energy. He says he gives them discipline. I nodded. He gives them discipline. Then he gives himself their vote. A barista called out names. A dog shook rain from its fur onto someone's ankle and nobody complained because it was still Seattle. I closed the portal and opened a different window. You but dialed me 2 months ago, I said, sliding an earbuds case across the table. You were leaving your mother's condo. You didn't know it was recording. She flinched like I tapped her with a live wire, but after a second she fit one earbud in and turned it slightly until it sealed. I pressed play. The tiny speaker delivered Linda's voice first, low and practical in a way that once made me less lonely. Assisted living isn't cruel, it's efficient, she said. He's not the man he was, and it's irresponsible to let him keep that house. Grant's reply arrived smooth as butter. We wait for a fall or a forgotten pot. Nothing serious, just enough for leverage. The market will carry the house to 900 easy. We can structure the narrative so it's all about safety. There was the muffled sound of a door shutting, a laugh that had no humor, and then the line went quiet. Evelyn plucked the earbud out and set it down like it might bite her. She watched it the way you watch a small thing that has the power to ruin something large. I kept my hands away from the table because I wanted to put one over hers, and I wasn't sure it would be welcome. Out on the sidewalk, a teenager bounced a basketball in slow, patient beats. The thunk threaded the cafe's background music until it became the only thing I could hear. I didn't... She started and stopped. She swallowed, tried again with less air. I never listened to that voicemail. I thought it was pocket noise. I nodded once. It was. She opened her mouth like she'd argue with the recording itself, then shut it and looked past me to a poster taped crooked on the wall. It advertised a lost cat with a reward, edges curling from too much humidity. You kept this to yourself. It wasn't an accusation, not entirely. I filed reports with SPD, I said. Dates, times, notes. 2. They didn't rise to harassment. The officer was young but kind, and he looked at my hands too long, like he was trying to decide if a man who picks splinters out of his palms all day can be coerced. I also updated the trust. That part is relevant. Her eyes snapped back to mine at the word. The trust was not a word she had earned yet. Not fully. I packed the Chromebook, slid off the stool, and nodded toward the door. We didn't speak on the walk to the car. The city didn't require us to. Down on 4th Avenue a bus exhaled, and an old man in a mariner's cap counted his coins twice before boarding. The hill took my knees like it always does, but adrenaline lent me a temporary youth I didn't trust. The Honda coughed awake. South we went, traffic lights ticking like metronomes, past the stadiums and their empty seats, into the gray spine of Soto where warehouses become storage units and every story looks like it could be about a man choosing between what he loves and what he can afford. Inside the storage facility, the fluorescent lights hummed too loudly, and the concrete remembered every footstep. We took the elevator because my knees asked and she didn't argue. The door of my unit rolled up with the sound of a zipper on a very old coat. Inside, the bins stood like rows of quiet soldiers. I have always believed that order is a kindness you can give your future self. Each lid held a year in black marker. She moved past her childhood like a museum visitor who worries the docent will try to sell her a membership. At the back, on the metal shelf I'd bolted to studs because I don't trust drywall, sat the Pelican case. Marine blue, scuffed, heavier than it looked. I coated the lock by touch. The lid lifted with an unceremonious sigh and released the faint smell of paper that hasn't seen air. She watched without stepping closer. Inside, in clear sleeves, lay the bones of the thing I'd built when the rest of my life was coming apart, the Mallory Family Charitable and Education Trust. The language wasn't pretty, but it was precise. It named Nora as contingent primary beneficiary, not Evelyn, not Linda, not any adult capable of signing a loan with someone else's future. It carried a clause I had written with a pro bono lawyer at a clinic that still uses staplers with missing teeth. Bad actors, I said, tapping the line. If someone exerts undue influence on me, or attempts elder financial abuse, or threatens to coerce me into selling assets for their convenience, disbursements to adult descendants freeze pending an independent review. The trust protector can suspend, investigate, and redirect. It's not a sword. It's a gate. She read the words out loud without speaking. Her lips moved slightly, a habit from childhood homework sessions, and then stilled. This is why you gave me that key, she said. Because you think I'm on the wrong side of the gate. I shook my head. Because I don't want you standing in front of it with people who would push you through. Her face went slack a second as anger limped away from the available facts. She traced a finger along the plastic of a sleeve like she could learn kindness through osmosis, then let her hand drop and stared at the floor. The cement held a faint outline where a box had stood for too long elsewhere, a ghost of some other life. Beneath the trust packet lay a tidy stack of confirmations. The transfer on death deed I had recorded so the Ballard bungalow would flow into the trust without a fight. A letter from a fiduciary I'd selected years ago who still answered her own phone. The page of SPD report numbers written in the blocky print of an officer trying to be clear. Tucked into the corner was a certificate with glitter around the edges, because children's futures should look like celebrations when they can. 529, I said, voice rougher than I meant. 2 years prepaid for Nora. I told the foundation who matched me that the only condition I wanted was contact. It's written so nobody can lock me out of my granddaughter's life without losing the money I've already put aside for her. I didn't tell you because I didn't want our conversations to become ledgers. She sat down on the cement as if her legs had thrown up their hands. The concrete will steal heat from a person no matter how stubborn they are. I passed her my jacket and she took it with the absent gratitude of someone who has just discovered gravity. You did all of this, she said finally. And you let me stand in your kitchen and call someone else my real father. There were tears, but not the kind that perform. These were quieter. Grown-up sadness doesn't announce itself with sound. It leaks out and makes the room heavier. I closed the Pelican case and slid it back, not to hide it but to say we were done with that box for now. We left the unit as tidy as we'd found it because grief doesn't excuse a mess. On the drive north, the skyline reassembled itself in the windshield. Cranes flexing like steel insects, the stadiums like sleeping beasts. At a red light on Denny I watched Evelyn's reflection in the glass of a bus shelter poster selling a shoe that promised to make running feel like flying. She was not the girl who asked me to check under the bed for monsters anymore. She was a woman who had, for a time, invited one into the living room. I didn't take her home. I parked at Cary Park because I wanted us to see the city at a distance, the way you look at a blueprint before you pour a foundation. Tourists queued for the spot with the Space Needle lined up just so. A couple argued softly about exposure settings. We stayed at the railing, shoulders not quite touching, the wind lifting the loose hair at her temple and setting it down again. Below us, everything looked solvable. There's one more thing, I said, and handed her the check Grant had laid on my table. She looked at it like it had been mailed to a stranger who shared her name. Up close, the paper revealed what performance tries to hide. Along the border, in microprint, were the initials of his family office, a watermark that was less security feature than signature. He likes spectacle, I said, but nothing he does is spontaneous. That check is a lever. If you'd endorsed it, the note he already drafted would have slid into place ahead of your first client call. You would have traded your company for applause. She folded the check carefully, once, twice, until it disappeared into her palm. She didn't offer it back. She didn't have to. I thought I was choosing stability, she said, not to me, not even to the skyline. I thought, if someone is strong enough to write that number without blinking, they must know something about safety. I let the wind answer that. It carried the smell of rain that hadn't arrived yet. It would have been easy to promise her we'd fix this overnight, that a few stern letters and a lawyerly glare would put greed back in its crate. It would have been easy and it would have been false. I don't hand my daughter lies. Not anymore. You asked me yesterday what a real father is, I said. Here is my answer, and it has nothing to do with jeans or checks. A real father tells his child the truth about how to walk through a storm. I reached into the backpack I'd brought and took out the thing I'd been building at my kitchen table after the world went to sleep. A binder with tabs and too many sticky notes and a clean label on the spine that I'd printed at the UPS store so I wouldn't chicken out. On the label I'd typed one word, not because I liked the drama of it, but because clarity is a kindness too. Sequence. I laid it between us on the rail where anyone could have seen it if they'd chosen to look. It held the order of operations we would need. A letter to Grant's counsel that names the conduct and puts him on notice. An activation script for the trust protector with a summary of evidence. A plan to have a pro bono clinic review his prior deals for a pattern and, if they found one, a referral to the Attorney General's Consumer Division. A disclosure Evelyn could send to her 3 anchor clients that would tell the truth without burning earth. It wasn't revenge. It was process. She put her hand on the cover without opening it. Her nails were short the way they were when she typed for a living, not the shiny weapons she wore when she wanted to look like someone's idea of success. What do we do? She whispered. The way she used to ask me how to carve a pumpkin without losing a finger. I looked out over a city that had taught me both humility and stubbornness and kept my voice low. "We don't swing," I said. "We file." She nodded once like an oath. Somewhere below us a car alarm chirped twice and went quiet, as if the city had tested its own readiness and found it adequate. The wind picked up. A boy dropped his ice cream and didn't cry. The Space Needle pretended to be a spaceship that could take any of us somewhere saner if we could just find the button. I picked up the binder, heavy and honest, and tucked it under my arm. Evelyn kept the folded check closed inside her fist, not like a prize, but like a document she planned to hand back at the precise moment it would do the most good simply by refusing it. On the drive down Queen and Avenue, she finally spoke, voice steady in a way that made me want to pull over and let my heart catch up. "I'll meet you at your house at 7, she said. "We go through every page. Then we make copies." "Bring the key," I said. She touched her pocket. "I already did." We hit the green at the bottom of the hill and rolled into it together. We started at my kitchen table because that was where the worst things and the best things had always begun. At 7 sharp, Evelyn set her phone face down beside the binder-labeled sequence and folded her hands like she was about to pray. The bruised outline of her palm on my cheek had faded to a faint warmth. The bruise on my chest where her words had landed would take longer. We worked in a rhythm that surprised me with how familiar it felt. She read. I annotated. She flagged. I numbered. I had already printed 3 sets at the UPS store because hope needs paper. We went page by page until the noise in our heads calmed down and the steps sounded like footsteps instead of thunder. Outside, Ballard darkened to that particular blue that lives only between streetlights and rain. Inside, we wrote ourselves a way forward. By the time we reached the tab marked notices, the air in the room had thickened with focus. I drafted language for a cease and desist that wasn't theater. No adjectives that would look weak in a courtroom. No flourishes to make anyone feel good. Just facts, dates, statutes. We named the conduct. Coercive suggestions about assisted living time to force a property sale. A $100,000 check presented as consideration for control. Documented communications that treated a father like a lever. We CC'd Linda as a courtesy that was also a grenade. Evelyn read the lines aloud under her breath, the way she used to mouth vocabulary words the night before a test. When she finished, she put the page in the pile marked Send Today without hesitating. That sound, a single sheet landing exactly where it belonged, felt like something sturdy being built under our feet. Morning took us to Pioneer Square, to a brick building that used to house freight and now holds the kinds of conversations you only have when you can't afford not to. The attorney was younger than my mistakes and older than my patience. A woman named Rachel Ito whose office smelled like legal pads and black tea. She listened the way someone listens when their livelihood depends on hearing what the question really is. We gave her the binder, the SPD report numbers, the transcript of the voicemail Evelyn had never intended to create. We didn't tell her about the slap. The mark had already said enough for us both. Rachel asked 3 questions that made me respect her and 1 that made me like her. Then she pulled our plan apart with a careful hand and put it back together with a layer of armor I hadn't known was missing. She liked the trust, especially the bad actor clause. She underlined independent review twice and nodded at the name of the fiduciary I'd selected years ago, a woman who still returned her own calls. She swapped 2 paragraphs in the cease and desist and suggested we add a second letter. An elder financial abuse notice addressed to Grant's counsel that would put him on record whether he laughed or not. "It's not about scaring him," she said, tapping the page. "It's about pinning him to a timeline." When she got to the part about the transfer on death deed, she leaned back and smiled with half her mouth. "Clean," she said. "You did this before desperation. Judges like before." I exhaled a breath I hadn't admitted I was holding. We left with stamped copies, a plan for certified mail, and a deadline on her calendar in a red pen that bled a little through the page. On the corner by the courthouse, the rain returned like an old friend with bad timing. We ducked under an awning and sent the letters from the USPS counter, watched the labels print in a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. Certified. Return receipt. tracking numbers written in my notebook with the neat block letters I once used on bridge drawings. I took a photo of each green card and sent them to myself because time teaches you that the only proof that matters is the proof you can pull up when someone says prove it. We emailed PDFs to Grant's firm, a name that sounded like a marble lobby, copying Linda so she could finally read her life without the soundtrack of flattery. There is a particular quiet that follows a good send. Not relief exactly, but the small quiet of gravity doing what it always does. From there we went north to a suite over a pharmacy where the fiduciary, Anita Kapoor, ran an office that made excellence look ordinary. She wore no jewelry and offered no small talk. When I finished explaining, she told me 3 things I needed to hear in exactly the order I needed to hear them. 1. The trust protector role existed to be used, not to decorate. 2. Interim holds weren't punishments. They were weather warnings. 3. If we were going to trigger the clause, we would trigger it cleanly. She scanned the binder the way you scan a horizon for lightning. I am imposing a temporary distribution hold on adult descendants pending review, she said, and typed the words in real time. You will receive a case number by 5. The printer whispered. The paper came out warm. I signed where she pointed. She signed where I pointed. On the way out, Evelyn touched my elbow lightly, so lightly I might have imagined it, as if to test whether the ground beneath us truly was leveling. We gave our afternoon to the Seattle Small Business Justice Clinic, a volunteer outfit tucked into a community college building where the chairs had seen better decades. 2 law students and a pro bono attorney with tired eyes took our stack of convertible notes tied to Grant's prior deals and began to map what Rachel had called choreography. I watched their pens sketch arrows between advice call, bridge check, and consent resolution. Watched their brows knit when the board seats kept finding a way to point back to him. We can't promise action, the senior lawyer said, pressing a hand to the papers like he was calming a restless animal. But if the pattern holds, we'll file a referral to the AG. Sometimes sunlight doesn't clean the mess. It just stops it from growing. He asked for permission to call 3 founders I had circled. Evelyn gave it, then added another name I didn't know. When we left, I recognized the look on her face from years ago, the one she wore the night before a final. Not fear, concentration with a seatbelt on. At home that night, we crafted a message to her 3 anchor clients. We kept it simple, a clarification that she remained the sole owner of her company, an affirmation that she would not accept funds tied to governance, a promise that her pricing and her priorities would remain unchanged. The sentences looked boring by design. We sent the note and closed her laptop and sat perfectly still because waiting is active work when pride is at stake. Within an hour, the replies landed soft as rain. One said, "Appreciate the transparency. See you Tuesday." Another included a smiley the sender probably thought made them look human. It did. The third said nothing more than understood. Good call. I printed those 2 and slipped them into a folder labeled clients because I've learned that on hard days a piece of paper can argue gently with panic and win. The next afternoon, the gym at Nora's elementary school smelled like floor polish and sugar. Blue painter's tape marked crooked courts, and the bleachers clicked and groaned under the weight of parents pretending not to care who recorded the video best. I sat with the program folded in half to stop my hands from fidgeting. When Nora walked in with her classmates, violin tucked under her chin like a secret, the world narrowed to a single square of light. Her bow squeaked on the first note. She didn't look at the ceiling for rescue. She found the pitch 2 measures later and held it like a promise to herself. I realized my jaw had unclenched. I realized I had forgotten the check entirely. Linda slipped in after the second song and took the last space in the back row. Standing because standing looks like humility when you don't want to push past anyone. She looked smaller without her perfume, younger without her performance. When intermission scattered the audience into lines for cookies, she drifted toward me in cautious steps. It wasn't a scene. It was 2 people near a bulletin board covered in flyers for a book fair and a blood drive. She kept her voice low and her chin down. Something close to apology lived in her eyes. She said Grant had asked her to soften me for a bridge loan that would tide Evelyn through while he assembled a roll-up of marketing firms rooted in crypto clients who wanted to rebrand as respectable. He wanted Evelyn's face on the deck, her story, her grit. He wanted the optics of a daughter cutting her father free and flying. As she described it, her shoulders sagged like someone removing a coat she no longer had the strength to carry. Then she asked if the trust could make a small exception, a short-term distribution, a temporary kindness that wouldn't really count. I told her no without making it a weapon. I told her the clause existed to protect all of us from our worst impulses and our best rationalizations. I told her about Nora's 529 plan and the foundation that would require relationship in exchange for scholarships. Not because I wanted credit, but because I wanted the next right thing to be visible right between us. Linda's eyes filled and didn't spill. She nodded once, like someone acknowledging the posted speed limit after years of gliding through yellow lights. When the children returned to play the finale, she slid away to the back row again. Evelyn caught my eye during applause and then saw her mother and looked down. The space between them was real. It was also not infinite. After the concert in the buzzing gym, Nora gave me a program with 2 wobbly hearts drawn next to my name. She ate a cookie the size of her hand and told a story with more arms than sentences. Evelyn listened and took a slow breath between each of Nora's run-on joys, like she was inhaling proof that love survived under bad weather. On the walk to the parking lot, the 3 of us moved in a line that looked almost like family. It was not a victory parade. It was better practice. The demand letter arrived the next morning with the slap of a courier's palm against my screen door. The envelope was heavy, the kind of paper that wants to be trusted. Inside, a partner from a firm whose lobby probably smells like lemons accused me of defamation, interference, and malicious dissemination of falsehoods that threaten our client's reputation and business interests. They demanded an immediate retraction. They also attached a notice of special meeting for Evelyn's LLC to be held 48 hours later in a South Lake Union conference room with a view of the Amazon spheres, for the purpose of ensuring competent transitional leadership during a capital event. There was a line about a videographer to document consensus for transparency. I read it twice, then set it down on the table next to the binder labeled sequence. The letter's tone was the kind of cordial that carries a knife inside. I called Rachel. She didn't do theater either. She asked for the PDF. I sent it. She called back in 6 minutes with a voice like a good seatbelt. "You attend," she said. "With counsel. Bring the binder, the certified mail receipts, and your doorbell footage cued to the minute he says sign just the receipt. I'll arrange for a court reporter. They want a performance. We'll bring a record." She also suggested a quiet courtesy, an incident notice to the building manager, not because we expected trouble, but because protocols protect the calm. I emailed a man named Harlan at the property desk and wrote 2 sentences that said nothing dramatic and everything necessary. He replied with a time-stamped acknowledgement and a line about security being present in the lobby, as is customary for after-hours meetings. Evelyn came over at dusk, her hair pulled back like she was choosing function over presentation on purpose. We didn't talk about fear, we organized it. We rehearsed answers that were not speeches. We practiced sitting still while someone else tried to fill the room with weather. Nora was with a sitter. Linda had texted a sentence that contained no advice. I took the mantle envelope with her handwriting and slid it into my briefcase without opening it, not as a prop but as ballast. We ate takeout from the Thai place that knows my order and folded the paper bags neatly before throwing them away because order is still a kindness no matter what you're walking into. Near midnight, I stepped onto the deck and let the cold lake air from a far-off city settle into my lungs. The conference room would be glass and light and the kind of modern chairs that pretend not to be uncomfortable. The videographer would wear black and pretend not to be listening. Grant would smile with his whole face and none of his eyes. The letter lay on my table like a dare. The binder lay beside it like a hand I could hold. Behind me, the red Craftsman toolbox sat exactly where it always sits, the right tool for the right job, each drawer sliding open with the exact resistance that tells you it was built by someone who cared about hinges. I closed my eyes and saw Nora's bow settle onto her string. The note found. The tone held. When I opened them again, the room looked like it had agreed to be steady with me. We slept a little. Morning would bring a suit I don't like to wear and a parking garage that pretends to be uncomplicated. It would bring elevators and a receptionist and a binder on a table next to a check that had started this. It would bring a room where a man would try to make power look like fatherhood for the second time in as many days. I slid the demand letter into a plastic sleeve, added a tab that said meeting, and put the whole thing in my briefcase like a promise I fully intended to keep. We don't swing, I had told my daughter. We file. Then we show up. The conference room looked like money had hired a photographer and asked to be lit from its best side. Floor-to-ceiling glass, a long walnut table that reflected the rain. Seattle laid out like a brochure through windows that pointed at the Amazon spheres. Even the water glasses felt heavier than necessary. Evelyn and I arrived 2 minutes early because being on time is another way of keeping your dignity. Rachel was already there with a flat briefcase and that composed expression that says, "Whatever they think is going to happen, we will make a record of what does happen." A young woman with a steno mask adjusted her equipment by the wall, and a man in black hovered near a tripod, lens capped, pretending his presence was neutral. The door clicked. Grant Whitaker entered with a smile calibrated to half a room and an attorney who wore a suit the color of midnight. He took the seat at the head of the table without asking. Rain needled the glass behind him. He placed a slim leather folder in front of himself and steepled his hands in a posture that turns conversations into performances. His lawyer slid a thin stack of papers toward Evelyn with a pen resting across the top as if the ink had been waiting for this moment since the first blueprint ever drawn. The title line read Consent Resolution of Members and Managers. The phrase Interim Chief Executive Officer appeared 3 lines below like a magician's dove peeking from a sleeve. I watched Evelyn's face without watching it too hard. Her jaw softened, then set. She didn't reach for the pen. Rachel's palm hovered a fraction of an inch above the table, a quiet restraint. The man at the tripod glanced toward Grant for a cue. Grant gave him one with his chin. The lens cap clicked off. On the glass, the city's reflection blinked like it had noticed our small drama and decided to be polite. Grant's voice filled the room the way his checks filled conversations. He explained the supposed urgency, the need for adult supervision during a capital event, the importance of optics when a founder was young and untested. He used the word consensus 4 times. He let the words funds already tendered land softly between us like a harmless napkin that everyone could see was a chain. I opened my briefcase and laid the check he'd thrown on my dining table beside the binder labeled sequence. Even at a distance you could read the microprint on its decorative border, the family office initials pretending to be security. The camera ate the tableau like candy. Evelyn lifted the top sheet of the resolution without shifting her posture. She read the first paragraph and stopped at the word irrevocable as if it had announced itself too loudly. She slid the paper back toward the neat edge where it had begun. The videographer adjusted focus for nothing. Rachel spoke very little, and when she did, it was to ask the steno to please mark the exhibits. She set the green cards from certified mail on the table like stones you put in your pocket before crossing a river, so the water won't sweep your name away. Grant's lawyer pivoted to authority and inevitability. He raised the check like a preacher raises a wafer and said consideration in a tone that tried to sound like Latin. I kept my mouth closed. I let him finish, let his certainty echo and thin itself, and then set my phone face down near the center of the table with the doorbell video cued to the exact moment needed. Rachel nodded, her expression one quiet yes. I tapped play. The room heard the timbre of Grant's voice in my entryway, heard the light clink of porcelain and the soft rasp of a pen moving across paper. "Sign just the receipt," he said, conversational as weather. "We'll handle formalities later." The microphone caught the follow-up. A whisper leaned into the air as though confidentiality were a seasoning. "This is how we install real leadership." On the screen, my hand did not take the pen. The videographer's camera swallowed our smaller screen whole. For a beat, the room didn't breathe. Then the attorney in midnight started to say something about context. Rachel slid a single page across the table with a case number and the title Interim Bad Actor Hold. Anita Kapoor's letterhead looked modest next to the marble stylings of everything else, which only made the words more authoritative. Pending independent review, all distributions to adult descendants suspended. The word suspended did its quiet work. I watched Grant's mouth harden and then relax as he recalculated lanes. He reached for a smile that didn't make it to his eyes. We didn't gloat. Gloating is hunger dressed in arrogance. And I was here to feed something else. Evelyn reached into her tote and lifted the white envelope from my mantel, the one addressed in Linda's looping hand. She had decided to open it here, not in private. I saw that choice register in the lawyer's face, a flicker of annoyance that a prop he hadn't designed was about to step into the scene. Evelyn broke the seal with her thumb, an unceremonious gesture made ceremonial by our collective attention, and unfolded the single page. Some letters can be read without air. This one needed steady lungs. She began quietly. It wasn't confession in the romantic sense. It was the truth a mother writes when she doesn't trust herself to say it out loud. I have been afraid that someday I will let money talk louder than love. If that day comes, I hope you remember which voice raised you. There was more, some of it too private to live in a conference room, but the line landed like a hand on a shoulder. Linda's handwriting wavered in two places. You could tell where she had paused and looked up, then put the pen down again. Grant's jaw shifted as if he'd bitten something sour and decided to pretend he'd expected that exact flavor. The midnight suit leaned forward. His cufflink clicked the walnut. He said there would be consequences. He said words like tortious and interference and spoliation of reputation. Rachel let him empty the bag. When he was done, she produced the smallest thing in the room, a tiny red light blinking atop a court reporter's machine. "You're on the record," she said gently, as if to a student who had forgotten where he was standing. She asked him to spell a last name. He did. The city pressed its nose to the glass. Evelyn unfolded the check and placed it in front of Grant as if returning a borrowed book. She did not push it. She didn't need to. "My company won't be governed by your money," she said softly. The sentence wasn't designed for the camera. It was designed for herself. She slid the resolution back as well, turned so the title faced him like a mirror. Across the table, my binder looked almost homemade next to his leather folder. But it had something inside his did not. A plan that didn't require anyone to perform. He asked what we intended to fund the business with if not expertise. I could have told him about late nights and notebooks and the way a child's recital can reset the nervous system of a grown man. I could have told him about bridges that hold because someone did the math with accuracy and humility. Instead, I laid out something smaller and more provable. I told him about the Tacoma pilot that had already cleared, about 2 clients who had insisted on paying more than we invoiced because happy surprises should be balanced with fairness. I told him we had pooled those returns into a modest, non-voting revenue share that didn't pretend to be charity and didn't ask to run anyone's life. $40,000. Boring money tied to performance, not promises. A fund with no beard and no hidden hooks. I set the term sheet on the table. It was 3 pages long because the truth takes less paper. The lawyer's eyebrows twitched in a way that betrayed interest he would deny later. Grant didn't look. He had moved into the act where he threatens the weather. He started listing the people he knows, the former AG who owes him a favor, the columnist who likes to sharpen the world to a point. He raised his voice a little, then remembered the camera and lowered it again. He said we were small and he was not, and that the story would be told his way. Then he called Evelyn by a nickname I hadn't heard since she was 12 and realized somewhere in the middle of it that it didn't fit anymore. It slid off her like a coat that had shrunk in the wash. The elevator dinged somewhere beyond the glass. Harlan's security presence arrived the way good security always does. As simple as gravity. A guard stepped into the doorway and stood at ease, hands visible, nothing aggressive in his posture except the quiet expectation that grown adults will behave like grown adults. He didn't look at anyone specifically. He looked at the room the way a carpenter looks at a door that has swollen in the frame and knows where to plane. Grant saw him and recalibrated again. That was when I almost felt sorry for him, which I recognized as a danger in myself and set aside. Pity can blur a necessary line. Evelyn thanked the court reporter. The woman's eyes softened over her mask. Rachel gathered our exhibits in the order she would want them when sleep tried to rearrange the logic later. I stacked the client emails we had printed and slid them into a pocket labeled Anchor. The videographer capped his lens with theatrical care. The rain fattened against the glass. The city did not clap. Grant pushed back his chair too hard and then steadied it like that had been his intention. He told us this wasn't over. He said the word discovery like it was a hex. He walked out with his lawyer one pace behind, the camera shadow carrying his tripod like a long regret. As the door settled, the silence felt like leveled concrete. You could roll a marble across it and watch it travel where it was meant to go. We stayed seated a full minute because staying seated is a form of choosing. Rachel broke the quiet first, not with analysis but with instructions so small they almost didn't exist. She told us when to expect the email confirming the court reporter's transcript. She asked Evelyn to send a calendar hold for 2 days out so we could debrief after the adrenaline had climbed down from whatever furniture it was currently on. She did not congratulate us. Gratitude can wait until the foundation passes its inspection. In the lobby, Harlan's guard gave a small nod like a mechanic who hears an engine idle clean and doesn't feel the need to brag about loving machines. Outside, the rain didn't hurt anymore. It just made everything honest. We stood under the overhang and watched puddles take the shape of the sidewalk and then give it back. Evelyn leaned against the cold metal of the railing and let out a breath she'd been composing since she first said the words "real father" in my kitchen and felt their shape in her mouth. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the check again, folding it once more until it was the size of a postage stamp. She didn't throw it away. She didn't crumple it. She tucked it back into her coat as if to carry a lesson instead of a trophy. Cars hissed past. Somewhere a delivery truck backed up. A polite beep 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 that sounded like the world apologizing for its edges. On the drive down Mercer, the spheres glowed like alien fruit behind rain. Evelyn kept her forehead near the window for a few blocks and then sat back, hands flat on her thighs. Palms open the way I taught her when she was 5 and learning how to calm a frightened dog. "You were steady," I said, because she needed a sentence that would sit in her pocket without jabbing. "So were you," she answered. And for a beat we were simply two people acknowledging that steadiness is the most expensive thing to purchase and the hardest to keep. At a light, my phone buzzed. Anita Kapoor's office had sent the formal notice of the hold, case number bold at the top, language that would look boring to anyone who hadn't lived long enough to recognize the miracle of a sober sentence. 2 minutes later, an email pinged from the pro bono clinic. Patterns noted, preliminary referral drafted, weather forecast updated. I forwarded both to Rachel and then to myself because the present is not a filing cabinet and the future is. We turned up Queen and then let the engine work. The binder rested on Evelyn's knees, heavy with copies and tabs, the way a book sits when its story has stopped being hypothetical. At the top of the hill, between a bakery and a florist, we parked and did nothing for 30 seconds. Sometimes the next step is to absorb that the last step held. Down the block, a father in a soaked mariner's cap hoisted a child onto his shoulders and ran laughing through a puddle deep enough to test loyalty. The child shrieked and then demanded to do it again. The man obliged like a person who knows how to give small requests the dignity of big ones. I watched them until the light shifted, then turned toward my daughter. "Ready to go home?" I asked because that word still meant something that had nothing to do with deeds. "Yes," she said, "but first copies." She tapped the binder and smiled a tired smile that looked like work and reward in the same breath. On our way back to the car, the wind tried one last time to push us sideways. Didn't. The door to the building behind us clicked locked for the night, a clean latch. Somewhere up there, at a table that liked its reflection, a chair sat in the wrong place, waiting to be slid back where it belonged. Tomorrow he would call someone with a different smile. Tomorrow we would meet Rachel and read the transcript line by line. Tonight we went home with a fund that didn't ask for votes, a letter that wrote itself into the right moment, and a small, hard piece of paper folded down to almost nothing that reminded us money can be loud without ever saying anything worth hearing. Autumn arrived like a kinder version of the rain, softer at the edges, more patient with old wood. On the first cold Sunday of November, I stood at my mailbox in Ballard and flipped through the stack. Grocery flyer, utility bill, a thin local business journal folded in half. I leaned on the porch rail to read it under the weak sun. The headline was small, buried below a story about a new brewpub. Family office faces questions over founder transitions. It wasn't about Grant by name until the 5th paragraph. Then it was all euphemisms and quotes. No charges, no accusations, just scrutiny. Sunlight on silk. Patterns of governance change, the paper said, as if you could make a person by rearranging a company's board. I folded the page carefully and slid it into the binder labeled sequence. Not as a trophy, but as a sign that some wheels were turning where they should. Inside, the house held its ordinary quiet. The new deadbolt clicked with a clean confidence when I shut the door, the kind of sound that makes a man feel less alone. On the hook by the entry, a small unicorn keychain dangled next to my keys, glitter worn off in places. Nora had asked for her own copy as if it were a graduation, and I had given it to her with a small ceremony at the kitchen table. She put the key on the unicorn and told me, serious as court, that she would keep it away from the garbage disposal and from dragons. Then she laughed at herself and hugged me like she'd invented the word. Every time I hear the unicorn knock against the hook, I imagine that little speech. I imagine the house learning her name. Evelyn's office lives above a bakery on 24th. You can smell the cinnamon from the sidewalk around 9 each morning, and by 10 the window in the corner glows warm with a cheap desk lamp and a better sense of purpose. I stop by on Tuesdays after an inspection if I'm nearby. I bring coffee and sit on the second step of the narrow staircase to catch my breath and listen. The keyboard upstairs ticks in bursts like rain on metal, the sound of someone building something invisible and real. She keeps the revenue share term sheet in a shoebox on the windowsill, taped to the inside so the paper doesn't curl. Non-voting. Boring. Honest. I have caught her looking at it the way you look at a photo you still can't quite believe is yours. The clients wrote their own kind of reviews this month, not on the internet but by paying early. She printed the receipts and hung them in a neat row that makes the place look like a laundromat for good choices. Linda sent a letter in a soft blue envelope that made me think of a church program. I recognized her steadiness in the handwriting before I opened it. She had started counseling. She was attending something that met on Thursdays where people practice telling the truth without making someone else smaller. She apologized without building a case or asking for an answer. Inside the envelope, tucked behind the page, she had slipped 2 Mariners ticket stubs from a summer when we were still trying to pretend the team was ours together. The stubs were sun-faded, the ink smeared in one corner from rain that had snuck under the brim of my cap. On the back of one she had written, "Thank you for being the parent who stayed." I set the stubs next to the picture of Evelyn in a cap and gown and felt something unclench that no injunction could have forced open. The inspector's ladder in my trunk has more dents than pride, but it still goes up straight. Most weekdays I move through Seattle one crawlspace at a time. Porches and joists. Nails that have decided to work themselves loose. New homeowners who worry about a hairline crack and elderly men who refuse to worry about a beam that needs love. I write my notes in block letters and tell the truth in short sentences. The work suits the man I have been becoming. Some afternoons, when the attic dust settles on my forearms and the smell of old insulation clings, I sit in my car and send Rachel a quick update that says only, "Breathing, steady. No letters today." She responds with a thumbs-up emoji she probably thinks is unprofessional and sticks in anyway. Once a week, a polite email arrives from the AG's office. "We have received the referral and are conducting a preliminary review. No fireworks. Just the slow turn of a wheel that doesn't care who is watching." Nora's violin found a new note. She practiced in my living room one Thursday while Evelyn took a client call in the kitchen, voice low, sentences clean. Nora's bow scraped at first and then softened. She paused to shake her hand when it cramped and looked at me with a seriousness I had seen once in her mother's eyes. "It hurts," she said, and then, "It will be worth it." I told her the truth. Most good things make you sore before they make you strong. She nodded without drama and tried again. The third attempt carried the pitch like a small light down a dark hall. When she finished, she put the violin in its case, then took it out again to check the clasp, then put it back because rituals keep fear at bay. On the side table, her unicorn key sparkled under the lamp. She tucked it into her pocket before she ran to wash her hands for dinner, palm flat over the shape like a promise she'd decided to keep. Evelyn still carries the folded check the way some people carry a coin for luck. It lives in the inside pocket of her coat, folded down until the zeros have lines in them. She doesn't look at it often. Once, after a hard day, She took it out and set it on the counter next to the sequence binder as if comparing weights. "Not a trophy," she said to the room, and slid it back where it belonged. The night of the South Lake Union confrontation, after we filed and didn't swing, Grant sent one more letter full of words with edges. Rachel sent one back that made his sound like a dress rehearsal. Then he stopped writing. His attorney liked the phone better after that. Calls make less of a record. We keep our own anyway. Anita's hold remains in place, quiet as frost. Nobody starves under it. Nobody steals either. I saw Grant once after the headlines, at a coffee line near South Lake Union where the baristas move like a good midfield. He wore a jacket you only buy when you're rich enough to pretend not to care. When he noticed me he braced, then reshaped his face into something smooth. He lifted his cup toward me as if to toast a foe he respected and might need later. I nodded the way you nod at rain. We both knew what the nod meant. Some storms clear. Some storms leave mold. My job wasn't to judge the weather. It was to keep my house dry. On a Saturday when the sun remembered the city by name, I took the Bainbridge ferry with Evelyn and Nora. We stood at the rail in coats we didn't need by the time the boat reached the middle. Nora leaned over with both hands hooked on the bar and shouted her joy into the water where nobody was offended by the volume. Evelyn watched her daughter and then looked at me like gratitude and regret were twins grown into different people. She started to speak. I shook my head. There are words you say in kitchens and courts. There are others you hold back while the salt air works the knot loose. We let the horns answer for us and then, near the island, we went inside for cocoa that was too hot and then perfect. After the ferry, we drove not to my house but to the Kitsap locker I'd rented years ago. I had told Evelyn about the second key, the one that wasn't for the storage unit in Soto but for the smaller space where the light switch sticks. I had never brought her here. I had waited for the right weight in our days, not too heavy, not too light. The hallway smelled like cardboard and winter coats. The lock took the key on the second try and gave the little click I'd been hearing in my head for months. Inside, metal shelves held nothing but photo albums and full envelopes. No appliances. No emergency cash. No secret paperwork. I watched Evelyn's face as the light settled on the spines. She reached for the nearest with the reverence of a parishioner. The cover showed a mariner's pennant taped crooked and a picture of her at 10 with a missing tooth. Eyes lit by something she had not yet learned to trade for approval. We sat on the concrete floor because there weren't chairs and because sitting on a floor you swept yourself makes memory keep its manners. Nora crawled into my lap without asking and turned the pages with both hands, careful like a librarian. There were Father's Day cards with block letters and glue dots, a photo of a meatloaf that was uglier than it tasted, a picture of the three of us on the Burt Gilman with a tire pump in the frame because I insist on showing the tools, not just the ride. Tucked into the back of the last album was a note I had written the night I signed the trust documents. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the ink had not faded. "Real wealth is what you can hold when the lights go out," it said. Names, hands, faces. If you're reading this, the power probably flickered and you found your way by heart. I handed the key to Nora first because I wanted the shape in her palm longer than the sentence in her head. She held it up like a medal and then looked at her mother. Evelyn closed her eyes, opened them, and let her tears fall without apology. On the walk back to the car, we passed a man helping his father down the hall one careful step at a time. The older man wore a navy cap from a ship that no longer sails. He didn't look at us. He looked at the ground to make sure it stayed still. I wanted to thank him for that concentration. I wanted to tell him steadiness is an inheritance too. Back in the car, we didn't turn on the radio. We let the ferry line move when it moved and watched gulls decide who deserved the best spot on a lamppost. When the car rocked onto the deck, Nora fell asleep with her face against the window. A stripe of sunlight slowed across her cheek. Evelyn tucked her coat around her and then, after a long breath, rested her head against my shoulder. It was the kind of lean-to people can only manage when they both accept what they are not getting back and love what remains. At home that evening, the backyard glowed under the cheap string lights I'd hung with more stubbornness than sense. The Weber hissed like a small train. The smell of charcoal found the corners of the yard where Linda once planted tulips. I stood at the grill in a sweatshirt that had learned my shape. Evelyn chopped tomatoes with the focus of a surgeon who had decided the afternoon's crisis could be solved by getting dinner on the table. Nora woke in the car and stumbled out holding her violin case like a suitcase you take even when you don't know where you're headed. She asked for a hot dog and a story, then chose the story when I made her pick one at a time. I told her about a ferry ride where a little girl believed her dad could make the gulls follow us all the way to the dock. She frowned at the math of it, then laughed and said, "That was Mom, wasn't it?" I saluted the small detective and handed her the mustard. After we ate, I took the red Craftsman toolbox from its place by the back door and set it on the table. The metal carried the nicks of a life that hadn't always been neat. I opened the top and took out 3 things: a flathead screwdriver, a tape measure with faded numbers, and a small brass tag with my address stamped into it. I screwed the tag onto the unicorn keychain while Nora held the flashlight like a cardiac nurse. Evelyn watched with her chin in her hand, eyes bright in the string light, the kind of watching that contains gratitude without making a speech of it. When I finished, Nora examined the tag with professional pride and clipped the key back to her belt loop. She looked, for a second, like a tiny foreman ready to sign off on a job. We did dishes by habit and left a few to soak by choice. The house breathed with us. Later, when the night deepened and the yard cooled, I stepped onto the deck alone and listened to the city's small noises. Somewhere, a siren traveled past and vanished. Somewhere else, a dog barked twice and then remembered. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Rachel, concise as ever. Transcript clean. Good record. Rest. I typed back the only thing the moment deserved. Thank you. The screen went dark. Behind me, the toolbox sat open, drawers tucked back in like a chest after a long day. When I locked the door, the deadbolt answered with its quiet certainty. In the hallway, the unicorn key tapped against the hook. In the living room, the binder on the shelf leaned between a cookbook and a mariner's yearbook, ordinary among ordinary things. In the smaller bedroom, where once there were boxes and now there was a visitor's bed, Evelyn slept with her daughter's hair draped across her arm like a soft claim. I took the blue Pelican case out to the garage and slid it onto the shelf next to the sandpaper and the paint cans. It looked less like a secret now, more like a tool. In the morning, when the ferry cut across a strip of sun, we'd ride it again. Not because we had to file anything, but because Nora wanted to see if the gulls still listened. We'd stand on the deck with paper cups and let the wind decide how we wore our hair. We'd let the skyline do its honest work of reminding us where we are. And when the cold bit a little too hard, Nora would unwrap her scarf and stretch it across both our shoulders without ceremony. The way children fix the world before the world tells them it's complicated. Behind our door, the toolbox would wait, clean and ready, not a weapon, only what it has always been. The right weight in the hand of someone who intends to fix what he can and leave the rest to hold.